for week 3 of this 4-week course. We've got one more to go after this. I think everyone was here last time, so there's no need to do a full introduction, but just as a reminder, we are coming at race from 3 angles. We've talked about it first as an idea with the vocabulary. We did that the first meeting. And now the last meeting in this meeting will be about treating racism as an institution with a history. And then in the next one, we'll talk about it as a sin with a power all of its own. So, and tonight we're shifting from the period of overt racism to covert racism. I've got some definitions here. Go ahead and share my screen with everyone. So this is marking kind of a big shift from a period when racism last week we saw was the law of the land. It was embedded into the Constitution and our founding documents, but also Supreme Court law, all the way up to the mid-20th century. And so we're moving now into the period that's closer to home, when those laws were off the books and at least formal equality was truly extended to everyone. And yet, even during this period, as we all know, when most people believe in white supremacy or wouldn't call themselves racists in public, white people somehow still end up on the top of most of the social ladders. So the question tonight is, how does that keep happening? But first, I just want to say a few bits about last week, just to jog our memories. We covered about 350 years of history last time, from 1619, when the first slave ship arrived in the US, to the Civil Rights Movement. And the main takeaway was that even though the Declaration of Independence said that it's self-evident that all men are created equal and entitled to inalienable rights, the practice of enslaving Black people had been legally accepted in all 13 colonies for 150 years. Even after we declared independence, it took another 90 years and a civil war for enslaved persons to be legally freed. And I took pains to show that even once Black people were legally free according to the Constitution, even once they were made American citizens, and even once they had a constitutional amendment protecting their right to vote, it took another 100 years beyond that for these civil rights to be actually protected. So in telling the story, I emphasize that the US has come a long way in race relations over the last 400 years, but I also noted that each moment of progress was bound up with episodes of white racial backlash that tried to undercut that progress. So if we're to come to terms with race, this ugly side of American history has to be included. And what's more, we need to acknowledge that all the gains that people achieved between 1776 and 1965 were, according to the Declaration of Independence, supposed to be their self-evident right from the beginning. This story also had an important lesson about both the importance and limitations of law in achieving racial justice. We saw that it's one thing for Congress to pass laws that say Black people are free. It's quite another thing, though, for people who have been enslaved for 10 generations, who have no money, no land, no educational facilities that will let them in, no ability to read because they weren't allowed to learn to read, for those people to become actually free. The changes in the law were vitally important, but they don't magically erase all that social inequality that had built up for 10 generations. So we're left with a question posed by Abraham Lincoln. How do you repair 10 generations of unrequited toil? How do you remake a society that for its entire history had used the law, but also other means like burning crosses and lynchings, to keep Black people in their place? How do we make racial equality and freedom self-evident truths that they are supposed to be? So to come to terms with race, as the point of this class is, we have to reckon with this long history, because without slavery and Jim Crow and the Black codes and all the things we covered last week, we wouldn't be where we are today. But it would be a mistake to think that racism only existed in the period before the Civil Rights Movement. There's a popular myth that racism was a problem in America long ago, when slavery was legal or when schools and drinking fountains were legally segregated, but that the civil rights movement fixed it so that we all live in a post-racial or a kind of colorblind society today. Now, this myth is a myth, but it's appealing because it demonizes those bad racists from the old South, those ones who burned crosses and lynched people. But in doing that, this averts our gaze from the racism that is much more recent and unfortunately much closer to home. So tonight, I'd like to move us out of the Aryan South and into the industrial North to the post-civil rights era. This is an era in which explicitly racist views were on the decline and in a geographical setting that never had Black codes or Jim Crow laws on the books, at least officially. And my thesis tonight is that while racism took a different form here in the North than it did in the South, it was still racism. So a couple of distinctions and then we'll get into it. Again, I want to clarify our terms because people use racism in all manner of forms. You'll hear people say, I don't have a racist bone in my body, but that doesn't mean that there's not structural racism around us all. So again, to be clear, racism means any kind of unjust racial discrimination as we're using it. In its overt form, it's the law of the land, it's written into the law, it's normal. In its covert form, this is when racism had to go underground. When it maintains when racial disparities are maintained even without it being the official law of the land. And usually the people who perpetuate this kind of racism don't mean to harm Black people. They're making seemingly innocent choices that still have race effects. And then this highlights another distinction between personal racism and institutional racism. Personal racism is the hiring manager who doesn't hire the Black guy because he thinks he's lazy. Or it's the uncle who uses racially charged language at the dinner table and makes everybody blush. This is a racism in the heart. It's based on your attitudes. And that's a different thing than institutional racism, which is a pattern of unjust discrimination according to race that keeps going even when people don't have personal prejudices. And this is a really important distinction for tonight because from the 1930s to the present, we've seen an extremely sharp decline in explicit racial prejudice in the United States. And here is the sociological studies to show it. So this shows public opinion in the United States on whether Black and white people can go to the same schools, whether they approve of it or not, whether Black and white people can be married, and whether people support laws prohibiting interracial marriage. And you can see over these many years, there has been a steady improvement on these racial attitudes. In the late 50s, something like 5% of white people approved of interracial marriage, but by the 2010s, over 85% of white people approved of them. This is a sea change in racial attitudes. These are all just of white respondents. And it means that the explanation for enduring racial inequalities has to change too. Why is it, if white people are significantly less racist in the personal racism form today than they were in the 1930s, do we still have this kind of wealth? The graphic that I'll keep showing, that white families tend to have 10 times as much net worth in 2016 than the average Black household. So beforehand, you could explain this based on there were racists out there who were excluding Black people from the privileges that white people have, but after those prejudices decline, how do you account for that? To understand that, we have to track the way in which racism went underground in the middle of the 20th century. What used to be visible to the naked eye now requires sociologists and statistical analysis to be revealed. But in innumerable ways, the pattern of excluding Black people from economic, educational, and employment opportunities persisted long after those steep declines in racial prejudice. Now, there are thousands of books written by sociologists who describe these patterns in detail and provide all kinds of empirical data to support it. And we could have explored any one of those tonight. But for this class, I thought we'd explore one particular instance of covert racism to get a sense for the texture of this and the feel for it, to see how it works. And I wanted to pick one that's literally in our backyards. The case of housing in Chicago is not unique. These practices happened all throughout the industrial North in the middle 20th century, but these dynamics were particularly severe in Chicago. There's a lot of data on it, and most of us know Chicagoland pretty well, so this seemed like a prudent way for us to go. But I did want to stress that this isn't somehow the only example of this, that Chicago's not alone in having this kind of history. But I do think it serves the purposes of this class. And I do want to say, just before we begin, that this brings the matter closer to home. And these are events tonight that many of us have lived through. And some of us were present in Chicago while this was happening. Some of us maybe even in these neighborhoods that I'll talk about tonight. So the topic tonight touches on our own families and our own lifetimes. And I have to admit that even though I've studied this stuff before, as I was preparing for this, the stories, the kind of the details of this still strike me and make me feel a bit uncomfortable too. So if that happens to you tonight, if you feel put off by some of this or feel unsettled, I ask you just to sit with it, to honor those feelings, and to stick with us too, because that might be the Holy Spirit tinkering around in our hearts and moving us into a new and more just kind of life. So I'll keep going, but if there's any questions, Jeff, just please be scanning the chat function. And folks, if you do want to ask questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I saw that there were a bunch at the end of last time, and I apologize we didn't get to those. I think they all came in right at the end, but I'll try to stop and take a breath once in a while and respond to those. So to begin the story, we need to start where we left off last time, in the deep American South. We saw that even after the end of slavery, the South remained a terrible place to be Black. To put it mildly, Black people had good reasons to want to get out, and millions did. Between 1916 and 1970, some 6 million Black people moved from the South into the industrial North and looking for a better life. This marked one of the quickest and largest mass migrations in American history. Check this out. In every US census prior to 1910, over 90% of Black people lived in rural parts of the South. But by 1970, only about 50% of Black people lived in the South. The rest lived in mainly urban centers in the Northeast, the Midwest, and then some on the West Coast. The Great Migration is why there are such significant Black populations in cities like Detroit, Minneapolis, Cleveland, and Chicago. As the US itself became an industrial power, the factories in these cities needed cheap labor, and Black people in the South were eager for better pay and for a better life. So they loaded onto trains and moved north en masse. This fundamentally changed the demographics of these northern cities. During the 1920s, African-American populations in Chicago increased by 114%. And between 1940 and 1960, the Black population of Chicago nearly tripled. Now, unfortunately, Black people who made this migration were met with violence on both ends of the journey. As they started leaving the South, white Southerners who depended upon Black people for cheap labor began to catch on to what was happening, and they did everything they could to keep Black people from leaving. They stationed police officers at railway stations who frequently confiscated the tickets that Black people had saved finally enough to afford to purchase to the North. Southern states passed laws prohibiting Northern companies from sending labor recruiters to the South to lure their Black workforce away. And there were plenty of cases where white mobs resorted to plain old-fashioned violence to intimidate Black people from making the already arduous journey north. But things weren't all peaches and cream when Black people got to Chicago either. Many in the first wave of the Great Migration found jobs that had previously been held by white people who had been sent off to fight in Europe in World War I. Of course, Black people fighting for the US in World War I too, but not nearly as many. And when these white people got back from the war to find a more competitive labor market, they were less than pleased. One example of this displeasure with the new job market in Chicago came in the Chicago race riot of 1919, which lasted from the end of July until early August that year. And this marked a period of racial violence in which white Chicagoans, who worked primarily in the meatpacking industry and in the stockyards on the South Side, most of whom were recent immigrants from Ireland and Lithuania and Poland, etc., destroyed Black homes and attacked Black people. Some 38 people were killed and over 500 were injured, and significantly over 1,000 Black people were left homeless in its aftermath. In addition to violence, Black people faced all kinds of other hurdles in their new Chicago home. They were categorically excluded from joining labor unions. This meant that they were frequently used as scabs, which is those folks who are hired by employers to fill in whenever union members go on strike. Furthermore, the Black people who did move to Chicago from the South were prohibited from living outside of a carefully defined Black belt on the city's South Side. So the Black Belt was the predominantly Black neighborhood. At the turn of the 20th century, it ran, for those of you that know the city, it ran along State Street from 22nd down to 31st. But by mid-century, it would go as far north as 12th Street and as far south as 79th. So this gives you a sense for the kind of blossoming population that's moving in from the Deep South. And when Black people moved to Chicago, this is where they went. In some ways, this sounds a lot like what the Irish did in Canaryville, or what the Ukrainians did in Ukrainian Village, or the Italians in the heart of Chicago, or the Greeks in Greek towns, or the Czechs in Pilsen. Different ethnic groups tend to stick together when they move to a new place. The same thing happens in New York or Boston or San Francisco. But the Black Belt in Chicago was different. It wasn't an ethnic enclave, it was a ghetto. Ethnic enclaves are sections of town where new immigrants typically choose to move because they share a common language, there's a common religion, there's common rituals, common holidays, common culture. Again, this is what ethnicities are. These are cultural groups. So when my great-grandfather and actually great-great-grandfather came to New York from Poland, fleeing the pogroms against the Jews, they moved to the Lower East Side because that's where the Jews were, and they spoke Yiddish. But what people living in a ghetto share, instead of this choosing to move somewhere, is a lack of alternatives. The word ghetto comes from Italian and was used to refer to the part of Venice where the Jews were forced to live. Like the Venetian Jews, Black people in Chicago didn't choose to live in the Black Belt. They were forced to. White people of all different ethnicities refused to allow Black people to move into their neighborhood and devised all manner of ways to prevent it. The central mechanism for combining Black people to the Black Belt was an instrument called restrictive covenants. In these, neighborhood associations would devise these restrictive covenants, which were legally binding documents that prohibited members of that association from either renting or selling property to Black people. Property owners associations used some similar tactics in Hyde Park and Kenwood, where Jeff and Allison and I all used to live. It's down near the University of Chicago. They even had a manual that prevented banks from offering loans to Black people, prevented Black people from renewing existing mortgages and leases, and even strong-armed hotels in Hyde Park until they agreed not to hire any Black people unless they lived within the defined Black Belt. Some of these associations also resorted to violence, and there's ample evidence of white mobs forming at the doorstep of any Black person who dared to purchase or rent a home in an otherwise white neighborhood. The de facto rule set by the Chicago Real Estate Board was that the only property that Black people were allowed to purchase outside of the Black Belt had to be in an adjacent block. So they couldn't leap across into a white zone. They had to just kind of inch forward block. So that meant that the Black ghetto expanded at a snail's pace, while the flow of new migrating Black families from the South kept pouring in. And to keep up with the influx of new people, again, there's nowhere to go out, or they can only expand slowly. So they're having to, landlords ended up gutting buildings and partitioning them into smaller and smaller units made with very poor materials to cram more people in. And white landlords rarely faced any penalties for ignoring building codes, which were already lax at that time. And as an example, in just 1 year, there were some 751 fires in the Black Belt, and tuberculosis infections were rampant. So this was not a pleasant place to be. Now, this all changed in 1948 when the Supreme Court ruled that those restrictive covenants were unconstitutional. This meant that those neighborhood agreements not to sell or rent to Black people could not be enforced, not legally. And the central mechanism for keeping white neighborhoods white was suddenly gone. So white people responded by getting out of town. Between 1950 and 1956, 270,000 white Chicagoans left. During that same period, some 300,000 new housing units were built in the surrounding suburbs. This meant, though, for the first time, that Black people could purchase homes in neighborhoods that they never thought they could ever get into. But there were still barriers to moving to the suburbs. Between 1946 and 1963, only 9 Black families moved into previously all-white suburbs in Chicago. 9 families. That's 9 families in 17 years from the Truman to the Kennedy administration. Between 1945 and 1960, there were 688,000 new homes built in Chicagoland, and of those, 77% were built in the suburbs. White flight is what this is called, perhaps more than any other social event in the last half century, has come to determine the present racial disparities in Chicagoland. Why is that? Any questions so far, Jeff? We good?
Not yet, Andrew.
Okay, good. One answer to that question is blockbusting. Blockbusting was a scheme devised by real estate agents and speculators in the 1950s and 60s to profit off of racial anxieties. In this scheme, an agent would show up at the door of a white family's home and tell them that a Black family is beginning to move or has moved into the neighborhood, and that this was going to decimate their property value. The point was to frighten white people into thinking that their middle-class neighborhood was soon going to become a Black ghetto, and that soon their house would be utterly worthless. So after sowing this fear, the agent would then offer a way out. He would offer to purchase the home at a price well below market value so that the white family could at least get something out of it before, so that they could move out to a new home and they wouldn't be left entirely penniless once the house crashed. Of course, lots of white people took them up on it. Some of them might have been afraid of living next to Black people. That's certainly possible. But I suspect that many others didn't have necessarily racist motives. They simply just didn't want to see the value of their home crash through the floor. It seemed to them like the rational thing to do. Now, when the agent purchased the home, he would then turn around and sell it well above market value to poor Black families. These families were anxious to get out of the Black Belt and to enjoy a better life in a middle-class neighborhood. But of course, Black people couldn't afford to buy these expensive middle-class homes, largely on the west side. So the agents would sell them these homes on contract. Now, to buy on contract is a form of what we would now call predatory lending. They effectively remove all the risk from the seller and place all the responsibility of homeownership on the buyer. In these agreements, the seller gets to keep the deed to the house until the contract is fully paid. The buyer continues to make a down payment and pays monthly installments, but they develop no equity in the home until the contract is paid in full. During that time, the buyers assume all responsibilities that go with owning the home. So if a furnace breaks, If the roof starts to leak, that's on the buyer. Now, this sounds like a terrible idea. It gets even worse. Not only does the buyer fail to accrue any equity, but if the buyer misses even one payment, perhaps because they had to repair the roof or fix the furnace, they lose everything. They had no equity. They lose all their monthly payments. They lose the down payment. They lose the house itself and any maintenance that they poured into it. They are simply put out into the street at the end of next month. Now, once a family was evicted by the agent, who of course still held the deed to the property, this agent was then free to find another poor Black family and set up the very same arrangement for them. This cycle meant that the middle-class residents on the West Side, neighborhoods like North Lawndale, where the old Sears Roebuck head office was, or Garfield Park, or Austin, as we talked about earlier, quickly fell into disrepair. This is why the West Side of Chicago looks the way it does. It's not that Black people that live there don't like nice things or that they don't want to take care of their homes. It's that the practice of buying on contract made it totally irrational for people to invest in keeping up homes that they really didn't own and could lose at the drop of a hat. Buying on contract made it irrational, just in terms of self-interest, for anyone to sink money into a new roof or landscaping or to repair a home's infrastructure. And yet, for those 30 years between 1930 and 1960, 85% of Black home buyers in Chicago bought on contract. Why would anyone take that deal, though? If buying on contract is so terrible, why would you, as a Black homeowner, attempt to enter into one of these contracts? The short answer is that, again, they didn't have other options. The normal 30-year mortgage offered by banks to other people was not a live option for Black people. Now, to understand this, we need to know that the 30-year mortgage wasn't always a thing in the United States. Before the 1930s, banks tended to issue mortgages with a maximum of 10-year terms. This meant that people who wanted to buy a home needed to make a sizable down payment so that they could pay it off within those 10 years. Most people didn't have the money for a down payment, and those who did often couldn't afford the steep rates that the banks offered. But all this changed with the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1933 that later became the Federal Housing Administration. These institutions provided government backing to private mortgages. So now banks could offer the now famous 30-year mortgage. Because they were insured by the federal government, homeowners could put as little as 10% down and get mortgage rates that were often much lower than these 10-year term loans. Now, this led to a massive increase in American homeownership. In 1930, only about 3 out of 10 Americans owned a home, but by 1960, that doubled to 60% in just 30 years. This should have meant that the Black families moving to Chicago's West Side could easily afford one of those normal 30-year mortgages. So why would you buy on contract? The answer has to do with redlining. And this map here shows actually one of these HOLC maps that from which the term redlining comes. When the federal government decided to insure private mortgages, they drew up a system of maps that rated neighborhoods on the basis of their perceived stability. They were color-coded, so green areas, like what you see in Streeterville and the Gold Coast there, were in-demand neighborhoods. Yellow neighborhoods were borderline, and red meant that the neighborhood was undesirable. These redlined neighborhoods were ineligible for FHA insurance. The federal government would not back loans on these properties. Neighborhoods that had even one Black family living in them were immediately prohibited from getting marked green. In fact, to get a green designation, one appraiser said that it could not have, quote, a single foreigner or Negro, unquote. If that was the case for neighborhoods with only one black family, this meant that predominantly black neighborhoods were entirely red. As such, they were categorically excluded from receiving these 30-year mortgages backed by the federal government. So this meant that black families had to buy on contract, because they lived in redlined neighborhoods and couldn't get normal loans from normal banks. Their only option were these predatory lenders who were making money hand over fist by exploiting racial anxieties. Now, in a previous iteration of this class, there was a real estate agent in the class, and she insisted very adamantly and truthfully that these practices of redlining and blockbusting are no longer legal. No real estate agency today, she asserted, would tolerate this kind of behavior, and perhaps that's true. It's certainly illegal to do so. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 made redlining illegal, so whole neighborhoods could no longer be cut out from these federally subsidized mortgages. But remember what we learned last time about the limits of passing laws to fix racial problems. Passing this law was a good thing. It stopped the bleeding, but it didn't repair the wrongs that had already been done. It didn't magically increase the property values on the south and west side that had already crashed through the floor. It didn't magically return the down payments and those monthly payments that white agents had swindled out of black people's hands. It didn't magically make up for decades of disinvestment and the dilapidated houses left in the wake of these racist real estate practices. So what you see on these maps, the first one is on the left is 1950, then 1970, then 1990, and then 2010. So they're 20 years apart from the 50s to the present. The red areas mark neighborhoods where persons of color are in the majority. The blue areas are majority white neighborhoods, and the white areas mark racially mixed neighborhoods. And as you can tell here, the supposedly free market doesn't pertain to the housing market in Chicago. You see that while there's expansion, these minority neighborhoods on the south and west side remain predominantly minority neighborhoods today. And you can see even in 2010, how much of the north side there, north of the loop, remains a majority white neighborhood, some of it extremely blue. Now compare these maps that show the percentage with other maps that show the percentage of vacant lots and unemployment levels. They map almost entirely over the predominantly non-white neighborhoods, the red ones. So that last map is from 2010. That's over 40 years after the overtly racist redlining policies were outlawed. And yet the effects that this earlier racism had, these economic and social effects, remain very much intact. I think this maybe is the most illustrative picture of how even once laws are passed, that the damage doesn't just get repaired magically, that it persists. And there are similar maps that you can see in dozens of northern towns. Jeff, did you have a?
Yes, there's a handful of questions, Andrew, that have popped up in the chat, if this is an okay time to post
Yeah,
them.
great.
Sure. So there was one a few minutes ago from Allison that asked about when was the height of the redlining practice, in particular the buying on contract. I can maybe give you all three questions and you can decide how you want to answer them.
He answered it after I posted.
You did? Okay. 1930 to 60, I think you'd said.
That's right.
Is that true, Andrew?
And they made it legal in 68. Yeah.
68. Okay. Thank you. And then a second question from David Rankin. Were these redlining rules part of the CFR, I'm not sure what that is, formal guidance or informal underwriting practices?
I believe they were the law, they were on the books of the, Federal Housing Association.
Okay.
Yeah, the CFR is just the Code of Federal Regulations, and I was curious about where these were formalized or whether it was informal. Thanks.
Yeah.
And then Mary Watt asks, were there any groups that were protesting these loan practices, at the time, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suspect so, because, I mean, they had, when the law was passed in 68, like laws don't just get passed because 10 people think that's a good idea. I mean, there's a social movement that makes all of this happen, right? So somebody was protesting.
Yeah.
And someone got that law changed. So thanks be to God. But same is true for the civil rights movement. I mean, it's hard to, I didn't mention this last time, because all those laws, these landmark laws in the 60s, didn't happen because people in Washington just woke up one morning and decided to make this happen, right? They had pressure applied to them from mass movements, and some of it was disruption in the streets that we're still seeing. So that's how things happen.
I'd like to jump in. We've learned through some of the research our justice group is doing is that there was a concerted effort in Wilmette in the 60s, especially the summer of 1965. There was huge effort among people of faith and other leaders in Wilmette that really helped change the practices, not that they necessarily went all the way away, but there was a lot of work on this in our village.
Good.
That's great. Thanks, Allison.
And then a final question, Andrew, which I think will be brief too. When did Black-owned banks come about and help shift opportunities for Black homeowners? Do you happen to know?
No, I don't know that off the top of my head, but I know that especially on the South Side, there were, I imagine very early on, but I don't have a date in mind. Maybe somebody, David, do you know by chance? Black-owned banks? No.
I do not know.
No, but that's one way in which the Black community that's not getting loans from other places is trying to take matters in their own hands and become economically independent. There is an interesting story from Oak Park, though. I appreciate the Wilmette one, but Oak Park actually, I found this out when I moved there. My wife and I rented an apartment in Oak Park, and the landlord there said that they saw what was happening on the west side of Chicago, and the municipality or the village actually guaranteed property values to prevent white homeowners from feeling like they had to flee, or else as soon as a Black family moved in. And that actually, Oak Park has remained relatively diverse as far as West suburban villages go. So there are things villages can do, and certainly people of faith. So I appreciate the reference there, Allison. Okay, so that's redlining. Of redlining. Redlining systematically excluded Black people on the South and West side from access to really subsidized mortgages. Instead of building equity and wealth, the little wealth they had was largely siphoned off into the hands of these white real estate agents who were peddling predatory loans. But this meant, on the other side, that white people were the almost exclusive recipients of all the federally subsidized mortgages issued between 1930s and 1960s. In fact, this figure is shocking. 98% of FHA loans went to white families. This means that when white people fled Chicago in the 50s and 60s, they were able to buy homes in the suburbs and build over 300,000 new homes because, in part, they had access to government subsidies from which Black people were excluded simply for being Black. Without government intervention in the mortgage industry, the huge increase in homeownership in 1930 and 60 would have been impossible. And yet, because the government intervention was racist, it meant that the largest housing boom in American history was 98% white. So there's 2 points to be made. First, the west side of Chicago and the west suburbs, and probably northern suburbs too, are two sides of the same coin. Where the west side saw government disinvestment and lower property values and lower rates of home ownership in Black neighborhoods, the west suburbs saw government investment that generated higher property values and higher rates of home ownership in white neighborhoods. So it's not like this didn't have an effect on the suburbs. This was directly proportionate or inversely proportionate to the suburbs' economic well-being. The second point I think is actually really interesting too. This housing boom that enriched white families was the product of government intervention. Federal government drew up these redlining maps that prevented the flow of credit into Black communities and effectively redirected it into white ones. So today, of course, there's strong resistance in parts of the US to anything that reeks of government involvement in the free market or the redistribution of wealth. But the irony here is that those who most vociferously denounce government intervention in the free market, not that long ago, were the primary recipients of that same intervention. I was talking with Jeff last time too about the Homestead Act. As the federal government was reneging on giving 40 acres and a mule to Black families after the end of the Civil War along the Georgia and South Carolina coast, they were distributing 160-acre tracts of land all throughout the Great Plains to largely white families. So that's an important feature here, that government reinvestments, redistribution of wealth has been part of American history since the beginning, and it's just benefited white people until most recently. So this, of course, has an effect on property values and school funding. How many times have you heard someone say that we used to live in the city, but we moved to the suburbs because of the schools? That's usually up there with safety and more space as the primary reasons that people find the suburbs so attractive. Public schools, of course, are primarily funded through property taxes, and property taxes are indexed to property values. So richer areas have much larger tax bases from which to fund local schools than do poor areas. Now, of course, money isn't everything in education. I received a good education at my poor Southern Illinois farm school. Grateful for it, and we didn't have a lot of money down there. But it is certainly something to have money in your public education fund. You all up near New Trier know that it didn't become one of the top high schools in the state by magic. It has something to do with the tax base that includes places like Winnetka and Wilmette, Kenilworth. So that's an extreme example, but it shows that there is a strong link there between property value and educational quality. And if suburban property values are inflated and urban property values are depressed because of this racist history, what do you do? Another major consequence has to do with our nest egg. For most Americans, the most significant investment we make is in our homes. We can build equity in it. So long as property values increase over time, and unless 2008 happens, they usually do, homes are a reasonably safe way to build a family's wealth. Now this wealth becomes generational. Because my grandparents owned a home, they were able to help it with my parents putting a down payment down. In fact, my parents' first down payment on their home in Louisville, Kentucky, came from my mother had inherited from an aunt who was a farmer and saved money all her life, but owned her home, part of the Homestead Act, and was able to give to my mother. And then when Sarah, my wife, and I bought our first home in St. Charles, we received a sizable gift from her grandmother that we could use as a down payment that she, of course, owned her home for all these years. Okay, so you see how this snowballs and wealth builds over several generations. Today, the median value of white households in the US is approximately 20 times that of Black households. 15% of whites have zero or negative wealth, where 33% of Blacks have zero or negative wealth. This has to do with the snowball effect. This is in part what has led to the massive racial wealth gap in the US, where the median net worth of a white family is about 10 times that of Black families. And this is an update. I was reading this in the New York Times this summer. According to Lily Batchelder, who's a professor of law at NYU, the largest wealth transfer in history of the world is currently underway. Baby boomers and the generation that precedes them hold some 81% of the entire household wealth in the United States, about $84 trillion. And when they pass on, they're going to pass it on as an inheritance to their children and their grandchildren. And this has a racial character. White families are twice as likely to receive an inheritance as Black families are. And when they do receive an inheritance, it leads to an increase in wealth in white families that's 26 times as high as the increase in wealth in Black families. So if the United States inheritance laws and death tax remains as they are today, this transfer of $84 trillion of household wealth will further cement and worsen the racial wealth gap. So this will only get more deeply embedded and in fact worse because of these disparities. Okay, I'm gonna shift now into a section on more dilemmas. I kind of want to bring this home. I hope that this has been clear. I know it's been a lot of policy, kind of wonky stuff, but I hope that it's clear what I'm driving at. But to kind of crystallize it, consider these two examples. Once we know the role that racism has played in housing in Chicagoland, our moral situations get more complex. Consider the good schools problem. Suppose you currently live in a trendy, racially diverse neighborhood in Chicago that you love, but the public school district you're in has a low ranking. So you're considering a move to a mostly white suburb with really good schools. This is a rational, perfectly good decision because education is a good thing and we should want our kids to have a good education. In fact, I think it's our responsibility as parents to educate our kids well. It will open the world to them, but it's also going to help them get into college and hopefully get a good job so they can fund my retirement. And yet, because we live in a world created by these racist policies of the past, where good schools are largely in white neighborhoods and bad schools are largely in poor Black ones or communities of color, the seemingly innocent, even morally responsible decision to help your kid get a good education further segregates our neighborhoods and our schools. In this case, good intentions and rational decisions that any parent would want to make for their kids leads to racial inequality. It's not racist prejudice. It's not that you're trying to continue to segregate Chicago or Chicagoland. It's that you're making just normal, rational decisions, and that's having those effects. Or consider the decision faced by those white homeowners on Chicago's West Side in the 50s. I'm actually really sympathetic to this predicament. Some real estate agent comes to your house to say that your house is going to drop in value by some 30% if you wait even 1 month before selling and moving. No one wants to take a 30% hit on their house. I don't think anyone here does. It's perfectly reasonable and perhaps even responsible to take their offer to buy your house and move out of town. This decision isn't based on feelings of prejudice towards Black families, or doesn't have to be. You might even be interested in getting to know your Black neighbors. And yet, because you're living in a world that's shaped by these policies of the past, the economics of the situation are clear. You sell and you go. This means that even unintentionally, the family contributes to the greatest transfer of wealth heretofore in American history. Or based on this Batchelder article I mentioned from the New York Times, all you have to do is obey current US inheritance law, just go with the flow, and you and I will participate in extending the racial wealth gap. Not because we're racist, personally, just because this is the complex situation. This is the institutional racism in which are stuck. So I think this is really tragic. I'm trying to highlight how tragic, how unintentional and tragic this situation is. You don't have to be a racist to contribute to school segregation. You just have to be a normal person who wants good things for your kids, or a normal person who doesn't want to lose an arm and a leg on your family's nest egg. So when we talk about institutional or systemic racism, this is what we're talking about. It has nothing to do with personal prejudice. You don't need to have a racist bone in your body to contribute to these systemic injustices. We do so simply by making rational, seemingly good decisions. So what are the kind of take-home points? Racial inequalities endure long after declines in explicit racial prejudice. To inherit a world that is shaped by a history of racism means that even innocent, apparently responsible decisions further entrench racial injustice. And that these connections, it's often, I think it's a frequent misnomer or misunderstanding in the suburbs that somehow those are, racism is a thing, or race is a thing that happens in the city and the disparities are there, but that we somehow are unconnected from it. It's stuff we see on WGN, but it's not stuff that we actually benefit from in any direct way. And I hope to show tonight that our property values are tied up with this. Like the money we have in the bank is tied up with this. The benefits that we enjoy are palpable, actually. And fourth and finally, white people didn't get rich on our own, and Black people didn't get poor on their own. White people got federally subsidized loans that allowed for this huge wealth accumulation and white flight. Black people were locked out from these loans and were prevented from building the generational wealth that I described in my own family that has snowballed into our comfort today. So this means that even for white people whose families moved from Ireland or Scotland or Czechoslovakia or Italy with nothing, their capacity to build generational wealth was entirely different from that of Black people. So that's what I came to talk about tonight. Questions, Jeff, before turning to breakout groups?
There's a couple really good observations, but maybe they'd be best brought into our breakout rooms. A couple questions about, I think your focus was more on the west side than maybe the south side. I think one of our group members grew up in Harvey, if that's correct, Carol. A couple of other south side communities that attempted to do the kind of racial integration that Oak Park did. And she just wondered about your focus on the west side, if this is very similar, on the south side.
I think the south suburbs are different. I mean, if you drive through Harvey and Midlothian today, it doesn't feel like Glen Ellen and St. Charles or Wilmette. I mean, I think it's, there was a difference. I mean, there was a strong kind of blue collar Irish population, especially in Midlothian at the time. And so the kind of entrenched wealth that we have in the west and north suburbs just wasn't there. And so you have much more racially diverse communities, not exclusively, of course, but.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. I think we could go to breakout rooms then.
Yeah.